Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling cases in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I encourage you to comment where you are listening from and the exact time you are tuning in. It is interesting to see how far and at what hours of the day or night these stories reach. The auction block at Johnson Square was unusually full that spring morning in 1846. Savannah's wealthy had gathered, parasols and handkerchiefs in hand, shielding themselves not just from the Georgia sun, but from the stench of unwashed crowds. Elizabeth Mount stood slightly apart from the others, her morning dress a stark contrast against the white linen suits and colorful gowns around her. 6 months after becoming a widow, she had finally left the seclusion of her home, not for social visits or church, but for a matter of practicality. The Mount Plantation, 7 miles outside Savannah, needed hands, and Elizabeth needed someone strong to manage the tobacco fields her late husband had left in disorder. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the square, presenting each lot in terms of muscle, teeth, and the potential to work the fields. Elizabeth watched with a clinical eye, her gloved hands clutching a small leather notebook where she had been calculating numbers since dawn. Her inheritance was large but not limitless, and every decision had to be measured carefully. When Lot 17 was brought forward, the crowd fell quiet. The man stood tall, shoulders squared despite the iron shackles around his wrists. His skin was darker than most, almost a deep blue-black in the morning light, and thin, precise scars marked his chest in patterns that looked deliberate rather than the result of punishment. But it was his eyes that drew attention. They were a striking amber color, and unlike the downcast gaze of others before him, he looked directly ahead, expression calm yet unsettlingly aware. Next, the auctioneer introduced a prime field hand. "Answers to Isaiah, about 30 years old," he said, his tone slightly less animated than before. "Strong back, good teeth, no visible illness, trained in tobacco cultivation." He paused, then added with unusual candor, "Previous owner deceased, sold as part of estate settlement." Elizabeth noticed how the gathered men shifted uneasily, how their wives whispered behind their fans. No one raised a paddle as bidding opened. The auctioneer lowered the starting price, still no response. Elizabeth studied Isaiah carefully. His posture suggested the strength her neglected fields desperately needed. His calm demeanor hinted at intelligence, a valuable trait if guided properly. $200, Elizabeth called, her voice steady and clear. The auctioneer looked relieved. 200 from Mrs. Mount. Do I hear 250? Silence followed. No one competed. The other buyers avoided eye contact with both Elizabeth and Isaiah. Going once, twice, sold to Mrs. Elizabeth Mount for $200. Only as she approached to finalize the purchase did she hear a quiet warning from Mrs. Harrington, the banker's wife. "You should know, Lizzie, that's the 3rd time he's been sold in 2 years. Each former master met with strange misfortune." Elizabeth smiled. "Thank you for your concern, Margaret, but I'm not superstitious. Besides, at that price, he is quite a bargain." What she could not know as she signed the papers was that this would be the most catastrophic decision of her life. The documents identifying Isaiah Boone as her property would later surface in the investigations of 1848, becoming public records that chronicled what locals would call the Mount Plantation incident. The carriage ride to the plantation was quiet. Elizabeth sat upright, never resting against the cushioned seat, while Isaiah rode on the rear platform, swaying slightly with the carriage's motion along the rutted dirt road. The plantation house came into view. A once grand Georgian home with tall columns and wide verandas, it now showed 6 months of neglect, the paint peeling and gardens overgrown. Even from a distance, the tobacco fields were in disarray. As they approached, Elizabeth spoke without turning. "My husband passed in November. The overseer left soon after, taking 3 of our best hands. The remaining slaves are mostly house servants or too old for field work. You have experience in tobacco. You will manage the fields and the 4 remaining field hands. Report directly to me, not to the house staff." Isaiah responded with a single nod, only noticed by Elizabeth from the corner of her eye. She continued, "You'll stay in the cabin at the northern field edge, separate from the others. The previous occupant was the former overseer. Work begins at dawn tomorrow." When the carriage stopped at the main house, Elizabeth stepped down without assistance. "Malachi will show you to your quarters and provide necessary items," she said, pointing to an older black man who had appeared from the side of the house. "I expect you at the main house at 7:00 to review the fields?" That evening, Elizabeth's diary recorded, "Acquired new field hand today. Isaiah, about 30, unusual in appearance but seems capable, purchased significantly below market value. This raises some concern regarding his character or health, though he appears sound. Margaret Harrington tried to warn me with stories of his former owners, but such superstition is of little interest. Tomorrow will show whether this investment is worthwhile." The diary did not capture a kitchen conversation from that evening, recalled years later by Malachi's daughter Sarah, who was 12 at the time. "That one's not right," Malachi whispered to the cook, Bessie, while preparing the evening meal. "Look at those marks on his chest. Those aren't whipping scars. They are ritual marks from the old country. My grandmother said men with those markings weren't entirely of this world." Bessie's hands trembled slightly as she kneaded dough. "Hush, Malachi. Miss Elizabeth is already in a state after the colonel passed. No need for more trouble." Sarah later remembered how her father lowered his voice further. "He's been sold 3 times since coming to Georgia. First master found in bed, eyes open, but seeing nothing. Second, walked into the Savannah River at midnight, fully dressed, no struggle. Third, shot himself in his study for no reason. After each death, Isaiah was sold quickly and quietly. The household watched from windows as Isaiah approached the main house at 7:00 sharp. His walk was smooth, calm, posture straight despite the long journey. Elizabeth met him in her late husband's study, now her own space, adorned with botanical illustrations instead of hunting trophies and plantation ledgers carefully reorganized. "The tobacco crop is failing," she stated without introduction. "The soil needs attention. The remaining hands lack direction." She handed him a hand-drawn map. "Here are the field divisions. I've marked the worst areas." Isaiah studied it silently before speaking, his voice deep and precise. "The rotation is wrong," he said, pointing to parts of the map. "Tobacco depletes soil nutrients. These sections should have been planted with legumes last season to restore the soil." His analysis revealed not just practical experience, but a scientific understanding of agriculture that surprised Elizabeth. Her diary that night noted, "Isaiah shows remarkable intelligence about crop rotation and soil management, speaks with clarity unusual for one of his station, recommends major changes to our planting strategy. Despite social convention, I am inclined to grant him authority to make these changes. Economic needs must sometimes outweigh tradition." Within 2 weeks, changes under Isaiah's direction were visible. The field hands worked with renewed focus. Elizabeth, observing from the upstairs gallery each morning, noticed how differently they responded to him compared to her late husband's shouted commands and threats. Isaiah worked quietly, demonstrated techniques himself, and assigned tasks according to each worker's strength rather than arbitrary order. Curiously, the house staff seemed uneasy around him. They avoided him when possible, and kept their eyes down when they interacted, not in respect, but out of visible fear. Only Malachi engaged with him directly, and their conversations, held in quiet tones on the back porch in the evenings, stopped whenever anyone approached. By early June, the first signs of the tobacco crop's recovery were apparent. Elizabeth noted in her diary, "His methods are effective. The fields show clear improvement. I find myself observing his movements from the study window, noting the efficiency of his work, the calm authority he carries. He commands. There is a strange grace about him that seems out of place for his position. Last night I dreamed again of the unusual markings on his chest. In the dream, they seemed to form words in a language I almost recognized. Around this time, Elizabeth began asking Isaiah to visit the main house more often, supposedly to provide updates on the plantation's operations. These meetings, at first held in the formal study with the door open as etiquette required, slowly moved to the conservatory in the east wing, a room filled with exotic plants her husband had once called a waste of space. Between the pages of her diary, later investigators would find dried plants, carefully labeled in Elizabeth's hand, with notes that they were provided by I.B., the only reference to Isaiah that did not use his full name, a small sign of closeness hidden in the formal language of her journal. The first hint that something had changed deeply came in late June. Sarah, now Elizabeth's personal maid after the previous one left citing illness, though rumors said she fled after witnessing something alarming, reported hearing Elizabeth and Isaiah in the conservatory. They spoke quietly, mentioning old ways and knowledge from across the sea. When Sarah entered the room, she saw Elizabeth examining one of the ritual scars on Isaiah's exposed forearm. Her gloves were off, her fingers tracing the marks with what Sarah described as a hungry intensity. On July 1st, 1846, Elizabeth made a decision without precedent. She noted it calmly in her ledger. Malachi was relieved of his duties as head of the household staff, and Isaiah was assigned to oversee both the fields and the domestic operations. "Efficiency demands central control," she wrote. The household reacted in stunned silence. That night, 2 younger house slaves vanished, fleeing despite the harsh penalties for runaways. They were never seen again. Isaiah now moved between the field and the house with official authority, though he still stayed in his remote cabin. Elizabeth's diary entries became more frequent and enigmatic. "I.B. has shown me the meaning behind certain patterns, the knowledge carried in flesh and memory, passed down from those who understood the true nature of the world. The Colonel never guessed the power hidden in this land, power that needs only the right focus to appear. We have begun preparations. The soil must be ready, just as minds must be ready. I.B. says, I have skill now. My hands no longer shake when I draw the symbols." By August, Mount Plantation grew increasingly isolated from nearby estates. Elizabeth refused all visitors, claiming illness, and conducted business only through letters. Deliveries were left at the property gates rather than brought inside. The tobacco crop grew with an unnatural energy. Plants reached heights that drew notice from the few who passed by, their leaves glowing an almost luminous green at dusk. A cloying, sweet smell hung over the plantation, noticeable from half a mile away. In her final diary entry, dated September 23, 1846, Elizabeth wrote, "Tonight we finish what was started centuries ago in another land, interrupted by chains, ships, and the severing of sacred connections. I.B. says the alignment is perfect, the moon, stars, and the flow of energies through the earth. What the Colonel tried to force through cruelty, I have cultivated through understanding. The tobacco has absorbed what was offered. When burned, it will open the path." What happened that night was reconstructed much later, mainly from Sarah's hesitant testimony. She had hidden in a linen closet after delivering evening tea. From there she watched Elizabeth and Isaiah walking together toward the main tobacco field. Elizabeth, dressed in a plain white shift instead of her usual formal gown, her hair loose, carried a brass bowl that shone in the moonlight. What occurred in the field remains mostly unknown. Sarah reported hearing chanting that made the air feel wrong and seeing flashes of blue light. Shortly before midnight, every dog in the area began howling at once. The household staff, already uneasy, barricaded themselves in the kitchen. At dawn, with no orders from the main house, Malek went to investigate. The tobacco field was devastated, plants blackened and shriveled as if struck by impossible frost, and the soil beneath was dark and stained. Elizabeth and Isaiah were nowhere in sight. Authorities were called only after a delivery man reported no response from the plantation for 3 days. Elizabeth was found in the cellar, sitting with her diary in her lap. She was alive but unresponsive, eyes open yet unseeing, body functioning, mind apparently absent. She spoke no words and recognized no one. The examining physician noted her pulse steady, breathing normal, but said the essential quality of personhood seemed gone. Isaiah was never found. During the investigation, several troubling details emerged. Despite its ruined appearance, the tobacco crop was harvested by Elizabeth's cousin, who managed the estate. Ignoring advice, he sold it to markets in Savannah and beyond. In the following months, physicians in Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia reported unusual delirium among those who smoked Mount Plantation tobacco. Symptoms included vivid hallucinations, speaking unknown languages, and, in some cases, claiming to be someone else entirely, with memories of lands across the water. Elizabeth remained institutionalized until her death 17 years later, in 1863, during the Civil War. She never spoke again, though nurses observed her sometimes tracing patterns on her arms, like the ritual scars described on Isaiah. Mount Plantation was abandoned after 1850 when the main house burned down under unknown circumstances. The land remained uncultivated, locals refusing to work it. Maps from 1868 labeled the area unsuitable for farming. In 1922, the Georgia Historical Society tried to document the case but found that most official records had been destroyed or altered. The diary pages used in this account survived only because the original investigator, Sheriff William Harrington, had copied sections before the originals disappeared. Even more unsettling was an event in 1967. During construction for a housing development on the former plantation, workers found a sealed ceramic jar of unusually dark, oily soil. Within days, 3 workers developed thin, precise scars on their forearms, identified by a supervisor familiar with West African Adinkra symbols. The project was never completed, and the land remains vacant. Occasionally, witnesses report seeing a tall figure in outdated clothing walking the perimeter at dusk, disappearing when approached. There are also rare accounts of a woman in white at the property's edge, eyes open but unseeing, mouth moving as if speaking to herself. The most recent recorded sighting was in 1968, when a graduate student researching slavery in coastal Georgia tried camping on the plantation grounds. He was found the next morning wandering along Route 17, disoriented and feverish, later sedated. He insisted repeatedly that she was still searching for him and that the tobacco remembered what it had been fed. Older residents of Chatham County still refused to speak of Mount Plantation, warning only, some bargains cost more than the price paid, and some knowledge, once learned, cannot be forgotten. In the Georgia Historical Society archives, a single overlooked page from Elizabeth's diary remains. It reads, "He is not in me, I am in him. The vessel changes, but the essence stays." The case remains officially unsolved. Weeks before that September night, servants reported Elizabeth wandering the plantation at night, barefoot and in nightclothes, returning at dawn with soil-stained feet and fragments of strange plants in her hands. She stopped writing letters except one to her sister, declining a Christmas visit. Its postscript read, "I have found a purpose beyond our society's small concerns, What Thomas sought by force I have discovered through older, wiser ways. Do not try to reach me again. By the time you read this, I will no longer be the sister you knew." Bessie, the plantation cook, Elizabeth had stopped eating meals prepared in the kitchen by mid-August. Instead, Isaiah brought her unusual roots and berries gathered from the nearby forests and swamplands. Bessie remembered seeing a clay pot constantly simmering in Elizabeth's private quarters, producing a steam that smelled like the breath of something that thrived on decay. When Bessie tried to dispose of the mixture during cleaning, she found her hands covered in a rash that left permanent marks on her skin. Perhaps the most disturbing changes were in the land itself. Reports from that time describe how the plantation's borders seemed to shift subtly, with landmarks showing up in unexpected places. The creek along the eastern edge of the property changed course within weeks, far faster than natural processes should allow. Hunters reported confusion when moving near the Mount property, with several experienced woodsmen becoming inexplicably lost in areas they had known since childhood. The tobacco crop grew with an unnatural vigor, accompanied by more alarming changes in the local wildlife. Birds were found dead near the fields, their bodies twisted and eyes clouded white. Some farm animals from nearby plantations went missing, only to reappear weeks later on Mount land, alive but acting strangely, refusing food, standing still for hours, or making sounds their owners said almost resembled human speech, though in no language anyone recognized. By early September, the remaining house slaves lived in constant fear. Sarah later said they wore small pouches of salt and iron nails around their necks, protective charms from African traditions that predated their enslavement. Malachi warned that no one should go out alone after sunset, and windows were lined with dried herbs thought to protect against evil. During this time, Elizabeth began her most disturbing practice, recorded only in Malachi's deathbed confession to his daughter in 1871, long after he had fled north during the chaos of the Civil War. According to him, Elizabeth started collecting small amounts of blood from household members while they slept, with such skill that most never noticed. The blood was added to the soil around certain tobacco plants marked with symbols carved into their stems. "Those plants grew taller than a man," Malachi whispered to Sarah. "Their leaves were streaked with red, and when the wind passed through them, it sounded like whispered names." The investigation after Elizabeth was found in her catatonic state was brief and superficial. Modern scholars reviewing the remaining records noted several suspicious details. The lead investigator was a cousin of Colonel Mount's business partner. Some witness statements were apparently altered after being recorded. The medical examiner who studied Elizabeth was later committed to an asylum, reportedly after becoming obsessed with recreating the conditions that caused her state. One of the few honest assessments came from Dr. Jonathan Merritt, a physician at the Georgia State Hospital who examined Elizabeth in 1858, 12 years after the incident. His report, marked confidential and discovered only when his papers were donated to the Medical College of Georgia in 1924, stated, "Mrs. Mount presents the most extraordinary case of consciousness displacement I have seen in 30 years of practice. While her body lives, her essential self appears entirely absent. More concerning is the occasional sense that something else occupies the empty space where her mind once was. Something that watches from behind her eyes with patience, waiting for a chance." The fate of Isaiah Boone remains the central mystery of the Mount Plantation incident. No body was ever found, and no sightings were reliably reported after that September night. However, in the decades that followed, reports came from port cities along the eastern seaboard, Charleston, Norfolk, Baltimore, even as far north as Boston, of a charismatic preacher who appeared suddenly among free black communities performed ceremonies blending Christian symbols with older African traditions, and vanished just as suddenly, often following unexplained deaths or disappearances among prominent white citizens. Descriptions varied, but some details were consistent. He had unusually dark skin, amber eyes, and ritual scars visible when he rolled up his sleeves during particularly intense sermons. Many accounts mentioned his extraordinary eloquence and messages focused not on heaven, but on reclaiming power through ancestral knowledge. In 1861, a Baltimore police report noted the arrest of a man matching this description for inciting unrest. The man was detained overnight, but was found missing from his locked cell the next morning. The officer on duty smelled tobacco smoke just before discovering the empty cell, though no one had entered and no smoking materials were allowed inside. A clearer connection appeared in 1878 when a small leather-bound book was found during renovations of a former boarding house in Philadelphia that had been part of the Underground Railroad. The book had detailed botanical illustrations and notes on preparing various plant compounds, many native to West Africa rather than North America. Interspersed were philosophical passages about consciousness, the boundaries between mind and body, and spiritual transference. The final page had a single inscription, I be, from the soil of Mount, now free in all ways that matter. Handwriting analysis done by the University of Pennsylvania in 1943 confirmed that some marginal notes matched samples of Elizabeth Mount's handwriting, while the main text was written by an unknown hand. The tobacco harvested from Mount Plantation in autumn 1846 has its own troubling legacy. Despite its odd appearance, it was sold through regular commercial channels, mostly to markets in Savannah, Charleston, and Richmond. By spring 1847, physicians were documenting cases of what one doctor called tobacco madness, mainly affecting wealthy white men who bought the premium Mount Plantation tobacco. Symptoms followed stages. First came vivid dreams with unfamiliar landscapes, then spontaneous speech in languages they had never studied, and finally periods of complete personality changes, where victims claimed to be other people, often recalling life in West African villages before capture. These episodes started as minutes but grew longer and, in severe cases, became permanent. One well-documented case involved Judge William Harrington of Savannah, husband of Margaret Harrington, who had warned Elizabeth at a slave auction after smoking Mount tobacco at a gathering in April 1847. He excused himself, dizzy, and returned 30 minutes later speaking in an unknown language. When guests did not respond, he switched to heavily accented English, identifying himself as Kessi Ado, a warrior of the Ashanti captured in 1798 and brought to Georgia on a ship called the Mercy. His knowledge of historical details he could not have known, later verified through shipping records, caused shock. More alarming was his certainty that he was this other person, with no memory of his actual identity or family. This transformation lasted 3 days before he collapsed, awakening, with no recollection but showing a strong dislike for tobacco. By summer 1847, authorities linked these cases to Mount Plantation tobacco. Remaining stock was ordered destroyed, though rumors said some had been secretly kept by those who had witnessed its effects. Dr. Everett Chambers became so fascinated by the phenomenon that he set up a research sanctuary near Richmond to study affected individuals. His notes, published posthumously in 1852, suggested Mount Tobacco had somehow become a vessel for the consciousness of enslaved Africans who died without proper burial or ritual. Their spirits sought ways to return and reclaim agency in a world that had stripped them of control. Chambers' research facility burned mysteriously in October 1849. No patients survived. Chambers himself was found seated at his desk, physically unharmed, but in a state identical to Elizabeth Mount's, alive but absent, his awareness seemingly displaced. The Mount Plantation property itself developed a reputation that endures in local stories to this day. After the main house burned in 1850, several attempts were made to revive the land for farming, all ending in failure. Crops planted there either refused to grow or yielded produce that caused sickness when eaten. Animals would not graze on the property and became restless when forced onto the land. In 1893, a northern industrialist purchased the land at a fraction of its potential value, planning to build a textile mill on the site. Digging for the foundation uncovered a circular stone structure predating the plantation, identified by archaeologists as a combination of African and Native American design, suggesting a cultural interaction not previously documented in the region. When several workers disappeared after entering the structure, the project was abandoned. The land remained largely untouched until 1926, when a portion was marked for a new county road. During early surveys, 3 engineering teams independently produced maps showing completely different topographies of the same area. The project engineer, in a letter recommending an alternative route, wrote, "There is something deeply unstable about the Mount property. The land itself seems to resist our attempts to measure it, as though its true character exists in a state of constant change." The most detailed scientific examination occurred in 1954, when a research team from Emory University performed soil and water studies throughout the property. Their findings, published in the Journal of Environmental Anomalies, documented several baffling phenomena. Soil chemistry fluctuated from day to day. Water samples contained organic compounds that spontaneously reorganized their molecular structure under observation. Most strikingly, audio recordings captured whispered voices when equipment ran overnight in certain areas, voices speaking in a mixture of English and various West African languages. The team's lead researcher, Dr. Marion Prescott, wrote in private correspondence later donated to Emory Special Collections, "What we are witnessing defies conventional explanation. The line between living and non-living systems seems blurred here. The land itself carries memories, perhaps encoded in ways we cannot yet understand." Most disturbing is the sense that these memories are not passive but active, that the past is not fully past and continues to assert its will. In 1968, the last documented investigation of the Mount case was carried out by graduate student Thomas Harrison, whose confused state after camping on the property has been mentioned. His complete field notes, recovered from his abandoned campsite, include entries in increasingly erratic handwriting. The final entry, dated October 17, 1968, reads, 3:27 a.m., awakened by what sounded like a woman's voice calling from the direction of the old foundation stones. Followed the sound, moonlight enough to navigate without flashlight. The voice stopped, replaced by the smell of tobacco, rich and sweet, unlike modern varieties. Reached a clearing where foundation stones barely visible through vegetation. A woman standing in the center, white dress, dark hair loose, approached slowly. She turned, face blank, eyes empty yet seeing, spoke a single sentence. "He has almost gathered enough vessels." Felt a presence behind me. Turned to find a tall black man, amber eyes, scars, on forearms forming shifting patterns. He smiled, said, "Some debts can only be repaid in kind. Some exchanges require equivalent value. Some justice transcends time." Reached toward me. Fingers elongated, became smoke, entered my mouth, nose, ears. Felt something inside moving aside to make room. Last clear thought, I am becoming a vessel. Harrison was later found 20 miles from his campsite with no memory of traveling that distance on foot overnight. After a hospital evaluation, he abandoned the research, left the graduate program, and according to university records, relocated to West Africa. Correspondence from the American Embassy in Ghana confirmed his arrival in Ara in January 1969, but his movements after customs were never tracked. The latest development in the Mount Plantation story came in 2003, when a tobacco company executive purchased several acres of the former plantation land to establish an organic heritage tobacco farm using heirloom varieties. Within months, he resigned his position, liquidated his assets, and founded an organization dedicated to tracing the genealogies of enslaved Africans and identifying living descendants. When interviewed about this life change, he gave a cryptic explanation. "I came to understand that some debts can never be fully repaid, but acknowledgement is the start of justice. The land remembers, the blood remembers, and those who were silenced have found new ways to speak." The foundation has since helped over 3,000 African American families trace ancestry to individuals enslaved in the American South. Each confirmed connection is commemorated with a tree planted on the former plantation border, each bearing a small ceramic plaque with a name and the words "remembered, reclaimed, returned." Locals report that on certain nights, particularly full moon nights, the trees appear to subtly shift, gradually forming a pattern only visible from above. Satellite images from 2019 reveal the trees now form a distinct shape identified by anthropologists as an Adinkra symbol from Ghana, meaning return and reclaim, a symbol representing the reclamation of stolen power. As for Elizabeth Mount, she remained institutionalized until her death in 1863. Hospital records indicate that in her final year she produced hundreds of drawings with whatever materials were available. Preserved in Georgia State Hospital archives, these consistently depict the same figure: a tall man with ritual scars standing in a tobacco field, partially dissolved into smoke flowing into the mouths and noses of surrounding smaller figures. Her death certificate lists the cause as general system failure, though the attending physician noted an unusual detail. At the moment of death, her vacant eyes focused, and she spoke her only recorded words since 1846. "The exchange is complete, the debt paid, the justice begun." Isaiah Boone's ultimate fate is undocumented in official records, yet stories across the South persisted in the decades after the Mount Plantation events. Witnesses described an unusual presence, sometimes seen as a tall figure with amber eyes, sometimes felt as an unexplainable compulsion, sometimes arriving with the distinctive scent of tobacco, often preceding sudden changes in fortune, those in power losing influence, and the oppressed finding new avenues toward freedom. During the Civil War, Union soldiers reported meeting an unknown black man providing intelligence on Confederate positions, appearing and vanishing inexplicably. Escaping slaves spoke of a guide who could move undetected through patrols. After emancipation, several former slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina reported dream visits from a scarred man showing them the memories of their own cruelty, vivid enough that some sought out former slaves to offer restitution. The last potential connection to Isaiah Boone appeared in 2017, when renovations to a historic building in Savannah uncovered a sealed compartment containing a leather-bound journal from 1872. The journal belonged to Rebecca Carter, a former enslaved woman who later established a healing practice. She documented visits from a man she called the Vessel Keeper, who taught her to use plants to heal the body by addressing the spirit first. Her description matches earlier accounts of Isaiah: unusually dark skin, amber eyes, ritual scarifications. He appeared physically unchanged over decades, and wherever he stayed overnight, tobacco plants thrived, even in poor soil. The final entry in her journal recounts a lesson on the power of presence, memory, and restoration, connecting the land, its history, and the people who endured its injustices. The Mount Plantation story, through centuries, seems to blur the lines between past and present, memory and reality, proving that some legacies never truly fade. In her journal, dated December 3, 1872, she wrote, "He says his work in this land continues, but is nearing its end. The vessels are nearly full with what was taken: dignity, identity, memory, power. When the exchange is finished, he will return home across the water, carrying with him the essence of those from whom so much was stolen. A justice beyond the reach of their laws, yet completely in line with the deeper laws that govern all life." He asked me to write down these words: "Let anyone who reads this understand. No debt goes unsettled. No act goes without consequence. No theft exists without eventual restoration. The tobacco remembers, the land remembers, the blood remembers. And I am the keeper of that memory until balance is restored." Rebecca Carter's building now serves as a museum devoted to the history of African American healing traditions in the South. Visitors often report strange phenomena. The scent of tobacco appears where there is none. Whispered voices are heard in empty rooms. Most commonly, people experience unusually vivid dreams of lives they never lived in places they have never seen. The Mount Plantation land remains empty, labeled on modern maps simply as protected wetlands. Development plans are frequently proposed and just as frequently abandoned after initial surveys show contradictory or impossible findings. The trees planted by the foundation continue to grow in a meaningful pattern, visible only from above. Even today, residents of Chatham County sometimes report seeing two figures walking the edge of the old plantation at dusk. A woman in white with hollow eyes and a tall man with amber eyes marked by ritual scars. Their shapes appear sometimes solid, sometimes dissolving into smoke that drifts toward the horizon, carrying with it the rich, sweet aroma of tobacco and the whispered names of those still waiting to be remembered. The history of this land is written not just in documents or maps, but in memory itself. Those who lived and labored here left traces that cannot be erased. It is said that the spirits of the oppressed linger, moving through the trees, along the waterways, and across the fields. The air sometimes vibrates with unspoken voices, calling the names of those who were lost, reminding the living of the debts that time alone cannot repay. Even the soil holds a memory, and every root and branch carries a story too profound to be told fully in words. People who visit the museum often describe a feeling that cannot be explained, a quiet insistence that someone or something is present, watching, remembering. Some see shadows flicker at the edge of their vision or catch the brief outline of figures gliding along the perimeters of the land. Others wake from sleep with impressions of places they have never known, or voices that whisper secrets of the past, secrets of survival, resilience, and pain. These are not simple hauntings, but the echoes of life interrupted, stories unfinished, and the work of remembrance that continues silently. The vessels he spoke of, the ones filled with dignity, identity, memory, and power, are more than physical objects. They are symbolic of the lives fractured and the justice delayed, yet not denied. The exchange he carries back across the water is not revenge, but restoration. Every act of theft, every wound inflicted, eventually meets the balance it disturbed. This principle flows through the land itself, through the patterns of the trees, through the lingering scent of tobacco, through the dreams and whispers of those who enter the space. Even now, the lines between past and present blur. Visitors report seeing the plantation as it once was, fields filled with activity, structures standing tall against the sky, workers moving with purpose, and figures who appear only briefly, vanishing when looked at directly. The woman in white and the man with amber eyes are witnesses and guardians, moving between worlds, ensuring that memory persists where history attempted to erase it. Those who encounter them often feel an unshakable presence, a solemn insistence that nothing is forgotten, that every story, every life has its place and its reckoning. The museum, the trees, the land itself, these are vessels of memory and truth. Each artifact displayed, each preserved structure, each carefully maintained plant carries the weight of the past and the promise of acknowledgement. The whispers that drift through the rooms, the scents that appear without source, the dreams that transport visitors to other times, all are part of a living continuum of remembrance. They remind the living that some debts cannot be repaid with money or words alone. They require recognition, witness, and honor. Those who walk the old boundaries of the plantation at dusk, whether by chance or design, glimpse a reality beyond ordinary perception. The woman in white moves gracefully, her eyes reflecting the depth of what has been lost and must be remembered. The man with ritual scars carries the weight of history in his posture, in the way he walks the lines of the land, in the amber of his gaze that seems to pierce through time. Together they enact a vigilance over memory, a quiet insistence that balance will be restored, that the stolen will be accounted for, and that the echoes of injustice will not fade into silence. The land remembers, and the people who respect it come to understand that memory is not passive. It is active, insisting, calling those who would listen to witness, to honor, to participate in a continuum that stretches beyond a single life or generation. The plants, the wind, the waters, the soil, they all carry the stories forward, ensuring that the past remains present, that no act is truly lost, and that every injustice, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually be reconciled. Even in moments when the land appears still, empty, or quiet, the truth persists. The scent of tobacco may drift from an invisible source. A whisper may curl around the corners of an empty room. Dreams may carry someone far beyond their waking life to witness the lives that were lived here before. And above all, the figures walking the edge of the old plantation remind all who see them